On August 9, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., an American warplane detonated an atomic bomb known as Fat Man on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. At least 3,000 people were instantly murdered by the bomb, which had the explosive strength of 22,000 tons of TNT. It was the day when the Soviet invasion of Manchuria officially began, but it was also the second of 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 3 days by an American government determined to force the unconditional surrender of the aggressor nation and speed the end of World War II. The Soviet assault, a classic double pincer movement with attacks from the west, north, and east, stretched across water and land fronts some 27-30 miles from the Mongolian desert to the densely forested coast of the Sea of Japan. Since the previous midnight, Soviet armies of more than 1 million men, supported by armored air and naval forces, had begun sweeping into Manchuria, the Japanese puppet state on the East Asian mainland that the occupiers called Manchukuo. This would be the final major military operation of World War II. WW2's History magazine contains further information about the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War, particularly the grueling combat on the Eastern Front. These attacks are not on a large scale. Japan's imperial headquarters issued an emergency announcement on August 9th, after confused Japanese units on the Manchurian border were subjected to intense shelling and massive ground assaults in the early hours of the morning. The announcement stated that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and had started to enter Manchurian territory, but it foolishly added, "The scale of these attacks is not large." In fact, the first elements of a 1.5 million-man Soviet host, supported by small cavalry units of its ally, Outer Mongolia, were already in motion. With the help of river flotillas, air fleets, and 4,300 Soviet aircraft, infantry, tank, horse cavalry, and mounted infantry would launch the invasion by attacking Japanese cities and convoys in North Korea and Manchuria. At the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the Soviet Pacific Fleet was prepared to conduct the invasion to the islands north of Japan, Sakhalin, and the Kurils, which had been lost by Tsarist Russia to the Japanese 40 years previously. The fleet also possessed the lease to the vital warm water port of Port Arthur. The time had come for Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to amass as much Asian wealth as he could, while also removing some of the tarnish left by the terrible, unexpected setback in 1905, the first time in contemporary history that an emerging Asian power had triumphed against a European force. In April 1941, the Japanese and Russians signed a 5-year neutrality treaty that was advantageous to both countries, since Nazi Germany's ongoing conquests in Europe threatened to extend the war to other continents and make it another truly global battle. Japan needed to protect itself from a threat coming from behind because of its expansionist aspirations to the south and east. Russia wanted no troubles in Asia, even before Japan and Nazi Germany were engaged in a life-or-death conflict. Stalin, confident that his eastern flank was protected, securely threw all of his resources into the fight in the west until the Germans attacked Russia in June 1941. In fact, Soviet neutrality in the east was so strictly maintained until August 8, 1945, that American B-29 bombers that made a forced landing on Russian soil while conducting raids on Japan had to stay there. The American blockade's strangulation of Japan. By 1944, peace on the Russian-Manchurian border no longer suited the United States, despite the fact that it still suited the two neighbors. In eastern China and Manchuria, there were over 1 million Japanese soldiers who could be used against the Allies at any time. The obvious way to counter such a danger was for the Russians to invade Manchuria. After nearly 3 years of intense American efforts, including the deployment of 250,000 Americans on the Asian mainland to support and counsel Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army in its fruitless war against the Japanese, U.S. commanders came to the conclusion in December 1944 that the Chinese could not defeat Japan's forces in Asia. Neither Mao Zedong's communist guerrilla troops nor Chiang's Kuomintang army put up even the smallest fight against the Japanese occupiers. It is obvious that both groups were more concerned with what would occur after the war was over, and the Japanese were expelled from the Asian continent. As a result, Washington looked to the Soviet Union, the only other force that could fight the Japanese. Washington pressed for Russian involvement in the war against Japan more urgently during the winter of 1944-1945. In order to reduce the number of Japanese they would have to face in the pivotal battles in the Pacific Theater, American field commanders desired all the assistance they could get. Stalin's pledge to send 60 Soviet divisions against Japan within 3 months of Germany's demise encouraged American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Washington understood that unless the Russians were given material incentives to fight, they would not. The Soviets had already sacrificed 25 times as many people as the other Allies combined in order to defeat the Nazis. The Kuril Islands, a largely uninhabited chain that stretched from Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula to the northernmost tip of the Japanese home island of Hokkaido, southern Sakhalin Island, the lease of Port Arthur, access to Dalian as a free port, control of the southern Manchurian Railway, and recognition of Soviet suzerainty over Outer Mongolia were among the demands Stalin made for an Eastern commitment at a conference in Yalta in early February 1945. When Roosevelt accepted Stalin's demands on February 8th, the 5th day at Yalta, he made significant territory promises to China without first consulting the Chinese. In exchange for Moscow's promise to acknowledge the nationalists as China's only legal rulers, Chiang Kai-shek ostensibly had to approve the agreements. American leaders welcomed any alternative that would avoid the need for a ground attack by June 1945, when a 3-month massacre had secured the island of Okinawa, the last stage in a land invasion of Japan. They had not yet considered the possibility of using atomic bombs against the Japanese. Instead, they relied on embargo, incendiary aircraft bombardment, and Russian intervention in order to win the war without conducting an amphibious invasion of Japan. In the weeks that followed, Harry Truman, the newly elected American president, became far less supportive of Russian expansionism and action in Asia after the successful July 16th atomic weapon test. An economic blockade that had nearly stopped Japan's ability to wage war was slowly choking the country. Furthermore, General Curtis LeMay's conventional bomber force was in the process of essentially destroying Japan, starting with the horrifying firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th. Approximately 2,000 civilians were killed when B-29 bombers from the Mariana Islands destroyed the majority of Japan's main cities. All of these considerations made an Allied invasion of the Japanese mainland less and less necessary by the middle of 1945, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria appeared unneeded to certain American political figures. But Stalin had his own goals, and the main one was Soviet involvement in the Far East, which was decided upon at Yalta. The Far East Command of the Soviet Union. Once again, their initial reaction to the invasion on August 9th demonstrated that the Japanese were either utterly ignorant of the gravity of their situation or just refused to acknowledge it. The Russians wouldn't be prepared to attack in Manchuria until the fall or spring of 1946, according to even those in Tokyo who had come to terms with the fact that Stalin was waiting for the right persimmon to fall, and who had been warned on numerous occasions about Soviet army movements eastward. Japan's Kwantung Army, led by General Otozo Yamada, was far from operationally prepared inside Manchuria. Months before, its finest forces had been dispatched to Okinawa and Kyushu. Some top commanders were not at their stations. Air support was minimal, and few demolition charges had been set. Tens of thousands of refugees from the Japanese home islands had relocated to Manchuria in the first few months of 1945, taking all they owned with them because they thought it would be a secure place. Surprisingly, no action was taken to evacuate these Japanese citizens, citing the belief that doing so would encourage defeatism. Massive territorial gain was Stalin's goal, and he was willing to pay a high price for it. The Soviets prepared medical supplies for 55,000 victims of the Manchurian invasion, including 16,000 fatalities, a prediction based on an evaluation of Japan's paper strength. Stalin increased his forces on the Manchurian border in the spring of 1945 after maintaining 40 divisions there for years. An extra 40 Soviet divisions were transferred on a month-long eastward trek to the Mongolian and Manchurian frontiers by about 3,000 locomotives that worked relentlessly over the Trans-Siberian rail link between May and June. Soviet forces marched the final 200 miles to the Manchurian border, across the treeless Mongolian desert in scorching heat, after railing 6,000 miles from Europe. The United States assisted in arming and feeding the Soviet host as part of Stalin's deal with the Allies. About 500 brand-new Sherman tanks were unloaded at Russian ports. Extensive deception and camouflage tactics were used as Russian soldiers drew closer to the border. Senior Soviet officials went under fictitious names and lacked rank insignia. The 6th Guards Tank Army picked up new equipment made in the Soviet Ural factories, leaving all of its vehicles, tanks, and self-propelled artillery in Czechoslovakia. The Soviets established a complete, independent theater of operations for the first time throughout the conflict. Marshal Aleksandr Vasilevsky, the commander of the Soviet Far East Command, carried out the straightforward but ambitious plan, which called for capturing Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and possibly even northern Hokkaido after encircling the Japanese defenses on 3 axes. The First Far East Front, led by Marshal K.A. Meretskov, and consisting of 5,865,89 soldiers, assaulted from the east, while the 654,000-man Trans-Baikal Front, led by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, would carry out the pincer movement on the west. With 33,796 men, General M.A. Perkayev's 2nd Far Eastern Front would conduct supporting operations against the pocket's core in the northeast. Using speed to anticipate Japanese reactions, this was to be a blitzkrieg attack, with a real strength of 713,724 second-line troops divided into 24 infantry divisions, 9 infantry brigades, and 2 tank brigades. Japan's Kwantung Army, estimated by Moscow to have more than 1 million men, was to be denied any opportunity to establish new defensive lines. The 17,000-man so-called Manchukuo Army, which was formed from local Chinese collaborators, lacked the resources and the motivation to provide the Japanese with significant combat support. In Inner Mongolia, 44,000 cavalrymen also aided the Japanese. There were 28,900 Japanese soldiers in the Kurils, Sakhalin, and Korea, as well as other parts of the theater. Conscripts, reservists, and soldiers who had been cannibalized from other units made up the majority of the Kwantung Army's remaining divisions. All troops had relatively little training, and the army as a whole suffered from a lack of supplies and equipment. An armored advantage of quantitative and qualitative. The number and caliber of the Soviet armored vehicles, which included 1852 self-propelled guns and 3D-704 tanks, were the most important components positioned against the Japanese. As the major Japanese forces assembled to hold a quarter of southeast Manchuria in the Tunghua area, fresh plans called for a portion of the army to delay actions at the frontiers in order to counteract the sharp fall in combat efficiency of the Kwantung Army. The Japanese thought that the Soviets would be exhausted before they reached the Tunghua region because to the undeveloped terrain, great distances, and resolute resistance. However, final designs weren't finished until June, which was too late to finish all the necessary additional fortifications and redeployments. Even worse, millions of Manchurian residents were not informed that they would be mainly left to the Soviet invaders, and lower-level Japanese officers were still unaware of the intentions. The Japanese defenders had 1,800 aircraft, of which just 50 were actual first-line aircraft, 60 pieces of artillery, and 1,155 armored vehicles, primarily light tanks and armored cars. For strategic reasons, the Imperial Japanese Navy had always opposed the occupation of Manchuria and made no contribution to its defense. Over the preceding 3 years, the Kwantung Army had moved its finest armored and elite infantry units, as well as the majority of its heavy military equipment, to the Pacific Theater. With little expertise and mobility and virtually no contemporary anti-tank weapons, the Kwantung Army had enough ammo by 1945 to give its riflemen only 100 rounds each. Japanese military intelligence failures. Other serious mistakes were made by the Japanese forces. They believed that any attack from the west would have to follow the old railroad line to either Hailar or Solin from the eastern tip of Mongolia because the Grand Khingan Mountains and the vast Mongolian desert made the western approaches from Mongolia impassable. Although the Soviets did launch attacks along these routes, their primary assault entered the heart of Manchuria by passing through the Grand Khingan range, which was said to be insurmountable, south of Sakhalin. Additionally, Japanese military intelligence was unable to ascertain the precise number of men that the Soviets were moving to the Siberian front. According to Marshal Vasilevsky's first orders, his troops were to launch an assault early on August 11th. He was instructed to move his schedule forward by 2 days when word of the American bombing of Hiroshima reached him. The Russians knew that Japan would soon surrender. Therefore, it became imperative to physically occupy the country and guarantee its future control. On August 9th, without artillery or aviation preparation, advance units of the Trans-Baikal Front crossed the border into Inner Mongolia and Manchuria at 12:10 a.m. Leading the offensive on the front, the 6th Guards Tank Army moved forward in 2 corps columns spaced 45 miles apart. The army of Kwantung gives up. By nighttime, Russian advanced guard units, forward detachments, and reconnaissance units had advanced 93 miles into Manchuria to the foothills of the Grand Khingan Mountains. The only real opposition was on the left flank, where the assault route of the Soviet 36th Army passed through defended border installations. As a result of the swift Soviet advance and continuous Japanese redeployments, small groups of Inner Mongolian cavalry were swept away as Soviet and Mongolian tank brigades and motorized cavalry pushed in 2 massive columns on the right flank, penetrating 55 miles into the dry wastes of Inner Mongolia. When there was no significant Japanese response on the evening of August 9th, the commander of the 6th Tank Guards Army finalized preparations to secure the mountain passes and start the challenging trek through them. Although the challenge of resupplying its armored tanks soon proved problematic, the 6th Guards Tank Army's progress remained exceptional. Starting on August 11th, fuel shipments were airlifted to the Advance Corps. The Trans-Baikal Front advanced to seize the campaign's final goals, the cities of Mukden and Changchun, after crossing the Grand Khingan Mountains in all sectors by August 14th. The 36th Army persisted in its siege of the Hylar defenses in northwest Manchuria on the northern flank. The defenders at Hylar, isolated and bypassed by the Soviet First Echelon, fought a valiant but ultimately unsuccessful defense. The Japanese 80th Independent Mixed Brigade was only considered 15% combat effective, but it needed the combined power of 2 Soviet divisions and a massive artillery armament to crush them. The last 38-27 defenders at Hylar gave up on August 18th. The Inner Mongolian 3rd, 5th, and 7th Cavalry Divisions fiercely resisted the Soviet Mongolian Cavalry Mechanized Group's 2-column advance at Kanbao on August 15th. Following 2 days of combat, the Inner Mongolians were routed by General I.S. Pliev's Southern Column, which also captured the city and captured 1634 prisoners. The Soviet Mongolian units arrived at Kalgan's outskirts on August 18th. The Kwantung Army's surrender had already been declared by the Japanese High Command, but the defenders of the fortified area northwest of Kalgan didn't give up until August 21st. Japan's massive Manchurian fortifications. Having done so, the Soviet Mongolian group marched on Beijing after crossing the Great Wall of China and joining forces with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army. The 6th Guards Tank Army started its advance on August 15th as well, but was met with opposition from Mongolian cavalry forces and deteriorating elements of the 117th and 63rd Japanese Infantry Divisions. While the 5th Guards Tank Corps and the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps marched southeast into Mukden, the Soviet 7th Guards Mechanized Corps moved east toward Changchun. The main Soviet forces advanced on both cities on the 19th, and 2 days later, the combined 6th Guards Tank Army took control of both Mukden and Changchun. Soviet airborne detachments then arrived at both sites. The 6th Guards Tank Army was forced to relocate further by rail to Port Arthur and Dalian due to fuel shortages. Now that the Trans-Baikal Front had accomplished its goals considerably in advance of schedule, organized resistance effectively stopped after August 18th. Since then, efforts have been made to disarm Japanese forces, gather captives, and take administrative action to seize the remaining portions of central and southern Manchuria. Japanese forces that were already stationed in central Manchuria or had withdrew there when the Soviet invasion started, like the 117th Infantry Division, never put up a serious fight against the Soviets. Conditions on the Trans-Baikal Front were very different from those on Marshal Meretkov's First Far East Front. The Japanese border regions of eastern Manchuria were more heavily guarded than those in the west, and the First Far East Front's 435-mile frontage, which stretched from the town of Iman on the Ussuri River to the Sea of Japan, was shorter. Large, intricate constructions made of reinforced concrete made up some of the complexes. At 1 a.m. on August 9th, amid the worst weather, the Soviets advanced all along the front without artillery bombardment, save at Hutu. Numerous attacks occurred over territory that the Japanese thought was insurmountable by massive armies. The main attack on the front was led by the Soviet Fifth Army, which consisted of 12 divisions and 692 armored vehicles. It hit the front and north flank of the Volinsk Center of Resistance, which was occupied by 1 battalion of the Japanese 124th Infantry Division, with 3 rifle corps at a time. Each rifle division was supported on the main axis of advance by tanks and self-propelled artillery. By nightfall, the 3 corps of the Fifth Army had advanced 15 miles into the Japanese rear and ripped a huge breach in the Japanese fortifications that was 25 miles wide. Remaining Japanese strongholds in the Volinsk, Suifenho, and Lumentai sectors were diminished by follow-on units. The heavily defended road junction of Mutanchiang, a vital communications hub, and the headquarters of the Japanese First Area Army, was the main target of the First Far East Front. Meretskov, impressed with his Fifth Army's accomplishments, ordered the attack against that city to be accelerated. One of the few multi-division, set-piece confrontations in the Manchurian conflict took place on the evening of August 11th, when advance elements of the Fifth Army moved into Mutanchiang's outer fortifications. The 1st Red Banner Army advanced on the right, northern flank, to reinforce the Fifth Army's onslaught. The Japanese 126th Infantry Division and portions of the 135th Infantry Division were waiting behind densely forested terrain, opposing the Soviets. In order to advance, Soviet forces had to construct roads through the forest. Many Japanese, unaware that they had been told to leave, decided to fight until the end. Half of the Soviet losses during the campaign came from the 2-day battle that started on August 15th. Once Soviet tanks had infiltrated all the way to the 126th Division headquarters, a group of transport unit firefighters, each carrying a 15-kilogram bomb, launched a suicide attack on the 5 lead tanks, 1 tank per man, and destroyed all 5. Getting to the 38th parallel. On the evening of August 16th, the 1st Red Banner Army finally left the city and started to push northwest toward Harbin. Meanwhile, 5th Army forces ducked south of the city and continued southwest toward Kirin and Ninggan. The 1st Red Banner Army and the 5th Army deployed to accept and process Japanese units that were surrendering on August 18th, the day the Japanese capitulation was finally announced. On August 20th, elements of the 1st Red Banner Army arrived in Harbin, where they joined the amphibious troops of the 15th Army, 2nd Far East Front, and Soviet airborne forces. Meanwhile, combined armed Soviet forces launched attacks to the west and southwest in the southern sector of the 1st Far East Front's operational area, with the goal of cutting off Japanese links from Korea to Manchuria. In anticipation of Japan's capitulation, Soviet 25th Army Rifle battalions, backed by the Navy, made a series of amphibious landings and overland marches to establish claims along the northeastern Korean peninsula. Red Army forces arrived to the 38th parallel, the prearranged border for the joint takeover of Korea, before the end of August. The 2nd Far East Front's supporting operations were conducted across a wide range of terrain across a broad front. When Japanese soldiers of the 134th and 123rd Infantry Divisions and the 135th Independent Mixed Brigade resisted the Soviet advances, some of the campaign's most intense combat took place. General Porkayev divided his army into 3 sectors, each with its own goals and axis of advance. The main assault took place in the middle, where 3 rifle divisions of Lieutenant General S.K. Mamonov's 15th Army crossed the Amur River and overran the enemy's entrenched areas at Fuchin. Then it moved through a mountain pass along the Sungari River to Harbin in central Manchuria, where it joined 1st Far East Front battalions. Despite certain challenges, the 2nd Far East Front successfully tied up Japanese forces in northern Manchuria and prevented them from joining the major attacks further south. The Kurils struggles. In addition to facing constant bad weather and challenging terrain, the Russians also faced formidable resistance, which was exacerbated by the Japanese warning of the attack and the challenges faced by the 2nd Red Banner Army when it moved its troops across the Amur River to take up positions on the right flank of Mamanov's 15th Army. Amphibian forces were attacking the Pacific Islands that Stalin had promised at Yalta, while Soviet armies were finishing up the occupation of Manchuria following the Japanese capitulation. Approximately 8,000 men were sent to the Kurils, which were 500 nautical miles away. Of the 25,000 imperial troops that defended the northern Kurils, 8,480 were stationed on the northernmost island, Shanshir, which was 18 miles long and 6 feet wide. Major General Fusaka Tsutsumi, Shanshir's top officer, was told to listen to the emperor's broadcast the following day, on the evening of August 14th. After doing this, Tsutsumi waited for an American occupation force to arrive, which he did not intend to engage in combat. Rather, a Russian division attacked Shanshir without notice or parley in the early hours of August 18th. The Red Army lacked the specialized amphibious equipment that the Allies had, and it had no knowledge of the challenges associated with opposing seaborne operations. As anticipated, the landing force's garrison troops with little prior combat experience found the Shanshir operation to be chaotic. On August 18th, when Soviet ships approached, Japanese shore batteries started fire around 5:30 a.m., drowning several and burning others. As Russian sailors worked under intense fire to make makeshift rafts to land guns and tanks, the invaders' communications broke down. A Soviet destroyer escort was hit by what was likely the final kamikaze airstrike of the war, and a counterattack by 20 Japanese tanks gained some ground. The Soviet commander on Shanshir was ordered to expedite the island's conquest early on the morning of August 19th. A Japanese envoy soon reached Russian headquarters to negotiate a surrender. However, several coastal guns in the 2nd Kuril Strait continued to fire on Soviet ships the following morning, and were brutally attacked in retaliation. After 6 to 14 soldiers were slain, Tsutsumi's forces ultimately gave up the struggle on the evening of August 21st. Sakhalin's bitter struggle. Sakhalin posed a less significant threat because its northern region was Soviet territory, and its closest point was barely 6 miles off the coast of Asia. However, the island was far larger, measuring 560 miles in length and 1,962 miles in width. The southern portion had been occupied by Japan since 1905, which infuriated the Russians. The landscape of Sakhalin was hostile. It was steep, swampy, and heavily forested. The Japanese had invested valuable resources in securing the area out of pride, and as a result, the Soviet troops that launched the attack on August 11th made very little progress. The crucial stronghold of Honda, where defenders battled to the death, was only taken by the Soviets after fierce combat. In an effort to outflank the Japanese defenses, the infantry had to fight their way through on foot because the weather was bad for air support and several Soviet tanks became bogged. The Russians caused enormous deaths as a result of the Japanese launching human wave counterattacks early on August 16th. The following day, Soviet forces pushed into the woods, pounding the defenders with artillery and airstrikes yard by yard. The local Japanese defenders in the frontier defensive zone gave up on the evening of August 17th. Dispersed garrisons on Sakhalin persisted in their resistance. On August 20th, Japanese troops began fire after the Soviet Northern Pacific Flotilla launched an assault force at the port of Myoka and mowed down civilians along the shore. Defenders had to be carefully removed from the quays and subsequently the city center because to the thick fog that made it difficult to observe firing. Japanese propaganda had successfully imbued the city's inhabitants with fears of Russian brutality, according to a later, dishonest Soviet narrative. As a result, many people fled into the forests, and some were transported to Hokkaido. The propaganda, which persuaded women that incoming Russian forces would shoot them and strangle their children, had a particularly strong effect on women. The remainder of the troops withdrew inland, although the Soviets claimed to have killed 300 Japanese in Maoka and captured another 600. On August 26, Sakhalin was eventually seized 4 days later than the Soviets had planned. Stalin had more ambitious plans for Japanese land. Prior to the start of the Manchurian invasion, Soviet forces were scheduled to land on the island of Hokkaido, which is home to Japan, and take control of its northern half as soon as northern Korea was secured. In the evening of August 18th, Vasilevsky sent a signal to Moscow requesting authorization to launch an attack on Hokkaido that would take place between August 19th and September 1st. For 48 hours, Moscow was quiet and pensive. Stalin instructed Vasilevsky to continue preparations and be prepared to attack on the evening of August 23rd, after he filed a second request for orders on August 20th. In violation of the Yalta Agreement, the Americans contemplated landing in the Kurils and at the port of Dalian on the mainland to secure bases before the Soviets could get to them. But at last, both sides retreated. Washington understood that any effort to stop the Soviets from occupying the areas they had agreed to could lead to an unintended catastrophe: the Russians' political justification for the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. On August 22nd, Moscow sent revised orders to its Far East Command, canceling the planned Hokkaido landings after Truman cabled Moscow to summarily reject Stalin's demand that Japanese forces on North Hokkaido surrender to the Russians. With orders to maintain these positions until Chiang Kai-shek's forces could take over, the Americans limited their actions to rushing Marine forces to strategic locations on and near the mainland Chinese shore. The nationalists were only able to re-establish themselves in the east in the fall of 1945, thanks to a massive American contribution of personnel and transport planes. The Soviets claimed to have killed, wounded, or captured 74,000 Japanese soldiers in Manchuria and the island operations, while the Red Army suffered 31 fatalities and 44 injuries. Thus, the human cost of Stalin's gains in the Far East was comparable to that of the U.S. takeover of Okinawa. Although Japan reported 21,000 deaths, the actual number was most likely closer to 8,000. Chiang Kai-shek had to plead with Stalin's occupying forces to stay in Manchuria long enough to give the nationalists time to send their own troops to seize control, far from the Soviets allaying others' fears that they would stay for imperialistic reasons. Stalin had promised the Allies to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists as the only legitimate government in China. Between January and May 1946, the Soviets ruthlessly pounded the area of all industrial remnants before withdrawing. They defended this by asserting that their loot was Japanese-owned rather than Chinese, and as such, it was a valid form of war reparations. The winners brought home everything they could, demolished steel mills and other factories, and shipped the loot back to the Soviet Union via the Manchurian railway that had been seized. In Siberia, hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners, both military and civilian, were forced to work for the Russians for extended periods of time while experiencing appalling conditions and inadequate food. Our people were not respected by them. Chiang Kai-shek made a strategic error by occupying Manchuria. When the Chinese Civil War broke out, his forces there were cut off. Large amounts of American military assistance to his army were ineffective and only served to highlight his regime's corruption. With the exception of the island of Formosa, which became Chiang's pocket nation-state, modern-day Taiwan, Mao Zedong ruled China in 1949. The Japanese catchphrase, "Asia for Asians," came to pass in a way that its creators could not have imagined. Chinese people, both inside and outside of Manchuria, had conflicting reactions to the news of Stalin's invasion. In the early days, the locals welcomed the Soviet forces with open arms. However, the purportedly freed residents of numerous towns and villages were brutally shocked by the days and weeks that followed the Russian takeover. After celebrating the Japanese defeat, Manchurian women were appalled by the Russians' behavior and were subjected to mass rape, a practice that Russian soldiers used frequently in occupied Germany and Eastern Europe. Among those horrified by the actions of numerous Red Army troops was communist guerrilla Zhuo Yong, who stated, "The Russians were our allies. We were all in the same boat. Their soldiers were like brothers to us. However, we found that the issue was that they showed no regard for our people." Jiang Dai, another guerrilla, shrugged and continued, "The Russians just acted the same way they did everywhere else.